Welcome students. In this class, we would begin up the textbook, Text and its Word, prescribed in your syllabus. The first poem that is prescribed in the book is Poetry Always Worthy. It is a collection of 6 short verses which are written in Sanskrit and translated into English by John Brough. Sanskrit literature, we all know, is a very flourished literature. It is a very glorious and remarkable literature. And when it is translated into English, it is in the reach of a wider audience. Translation, it helps in cutting across language barriers and interacting with the literary text or the literary richness of a particular language. So the books, novels, poetry, text, they are translated into various languages so that they can be read by people in other countries, as well as it can be compared to other literature which is written in another language. In this section, we have 3 Sanskrit poets, the famous Sanskrit poets Kalidas, Bhavabhuti and Bhartrihari. So let's discuss the text. The first piece of verse that is prescribed is Poetry Worthy When It Is Old is by Kalidas. Kalidas is a renowned Sanskrit poet and dramatist who lived from the mid-4th to the early 5th century. His works include Shakuntalam and Meghadutam. His court drama in verse, they relate fanciful or mythological tales of romantic love, intensified and matured by adversity. So in this short piece, the poet is actually mentioning that the quality of poetry does not basically depend upon whether it is old or whether it is new. So qualitative poetry or worthy poetry or good poetry, it can also come from new poets. It does not have to be old, is not the standard. So the poet says, is poetry worthy when it is old? Now the question always arises that are only the classics worthy of reading, and is it worthless then because it is new? And if it should not be taken into account, if it is written by new poets or if it belongs to new genre or area of poetry. So he is saying that let the readers decide that whether poetry is worthy, whether poetry is good, or whether it is unworthy. So he attributes it, or he gives the entire responsibility to readers. Reader, decide yourself if this be true. So it is the readers who have to decide whether the poetry is worthy or whether it is unworthy. It does not depend whether it is written by classic old writers or it is written by new writers. Fools suspend judgment waiting to be told. And the poet says that you are able enough to decide by yourself. So just apply your faculties, apply your skills, and through your reading, decide whether the text or whether the poem, is it worthy or it is unworthy. Because fools suspend judgment. Only fools, they believe in or they follow the judgment of others. But the reasoned, intelligent people, they would always exercise their own judgment and they would decide for themselves. So in this short piece, Kalidas basically asserts that the quality of poetry or the quality of literature does not basically depend upon by whom, or whether it is written by classics or whether it is written by new writers, means old writers or classic reading, it should not outrightly deride the new genre or new writings in poetry. Because worthy poetry, it can come from old writers as well as new writers. And so readers, they should explore the work and then decide whether the poetry is worthy or it is unworthy. The next piece of verse prescribed for us is written by Bhavabhuti. Bhavabhuti, Sanskrit poet and dramatist, he lived in the early 8th century. His work was notable for its suspense and vivid characterization. Bhavabhuti is known for his 3 plays, Mahavir Charitam, Malati Madhavam and Uttar Ramcharitam. In this piece of verse, the poet says, if learned critics publicly deride my verse, well, let them. Not for them I wrote, one day a man shall live to share my thought, for time is endless and the word is wide. So, in this piece of verse, Bhavabhuti is saying that the critics, they are not the yardstick, they are not the criteria for judging any work of literature. Because even critics, they judge a work by the yardstick that is actually set by the theory or by the rules of criticism. So he is saying that if new ideas or new theory of literature comes in, the critics, they do not accept it because they judge a work from the theories which are established. So in these lines, the poet is saying that if learned critics, they publicly deride or they publicly criticize my poem, well, let them. Because I'm not writing my poems for the sake of critics. When people, they would explore, when the readers, they would explore, and because literature, it travels widely, it travels through the ages, one day a man shall live to share my thought. At that time, people would understand the modernity, the change in my work, and because literature is not restricted to time. So the future generations or the coming generations, or when it would travel, people would understand my work, because I believe that for a literary work, for poetry, time is endless and it is not restricted to one area, one region, one word. The entire word is open for literature. So people, they would understand my work and let them judge it, not the critics. So my poetry is not for the critics, it is for the readers. And when the time would come, people would understand the new thoughts, new wave of understanding in my work. The third piece of verse that is prescribed is by Bhartrhari. Bhartrhari, Sanskrit poet, philosopher and grammarian, lived in the later half of the 5th century. Vakyapad is his major work on the philosophy of language. Also ascribed to him are 3 collections of poetry, each containing 100 verses. His poetry reflects themes such as wisdom, the word, love and renunciation. So, in this piece of verse, Bhartrhari says, of what use is the poet's poem, of what use is the bowman's dart, unless another's senses reel, when it sticks quivering in the heart. So the poet believes that the poem which is written by a poet has a purpose. As the dart of a bowman, it has a purpose. It should not be wasted. So any poet who is writing a poem, they should have a purpose in mind. And what should be the purpose? To reel the senses. Because it should strike the emotions, the thought and the faculty of the readers. So it should actually make the people think. So the senses, they should reel by reading the poem. So the new thoughts, the new ideas, or appealing to the senses should be the purpose of the poet while writing a poem. And exactly, it should be the purpose of the dart which the bowman strikes when it sticks quivering in the heart. And what should be the purpose? The dart, it should strike the heart. It should stick in the heart, and similarly, the poet's poem, it should appeal to the senses of the people, the faculties of the people, and it should appeal to their heart and mind and let them think. So the first three selections, they are comment upon poetry. That poetry, for its quality, it does not depend upon the old and the new. And the second piece, it says that the judgment of a worthy poetry is not dependent upon critics, because critics, they judge a work from the yardstick which is set up by the theories of criticism. When the new ideas or new thoughts come in, critics, they fail to understand because they are quite restricted by the theories which have been set. So for the new ideas, it travels through time and places, and people understand and they welcome the change. The third section basically speaks about the purpose of poetry, that the purpose of poetry is to reel the senses of the readers, to make them think. The fourth piece is also written by Bhartrihari, and in this piece of verse, the poet says, "Scoundrels without the wit to fit a word or two of verse together are daunted not a whit to sit in judgment on the abstruse poetry of another. Such man will listen with attentive mind, alert to see how many faults they find, and if they are vexed because they fail to grasp the sense of works conceived for readers of intelligence, they naturally do not blame their foolishness. A girl who is less than perfect always blames the dress." So the fourth section, it basically criticizes the critics, and they are actually being termed up as scoundrel. So the rejection of any work by the critics is of no values because they are just treated like scoundrels. They cannot write poetry, they are not creative people, they cannot write down even word or two of poems, they cannot put in a line together. And when they become a critic, they sit in the judgment seat and they comment upon the poetry which is written or the creative pursuits of the writers or the poets. And they listen, the critics, they listen with attentive mind. And why they listen? They do not listen to admire, they just listen so that they can find fault. And when they say that they are not able to understand the poetry, that does not really mean that the poet, he has not written well, or the poetry is not worthy, but because their understanding is not to the standard of the creative artist. So they fail to grasp the sense, they fail to grasp the meaning of works which is conceived by the readers of intelligence. For whom it is written? It is written for readers. And these readers, they are intelligent, they can understand. A critic, he should not come between the writer or the reader. There should be a direct connection between the reader and the poet. And when the critics, because of their limited understanding, because of their limited knowledge, they do not understand the modern ideas or the ideas of the poet or the creative artist who is trying to bring something new to his poetry, they do not blame their foolishness, but they blame the poet or the creative writer. So a girl who is less than perfect always blames the dress. And the poet, he compares these critics who do not understand the new ideas or the new thought to a girl who is not beautiful, and she does not blame her ugliness for not looking good. She always blames her dress. A bad workman always quarrels with his tools. The next piece of verse is also written by Bhartrihari, and in this piece of verse, the poet says, "A man lives long who lives 100 years, yet half is sleep and half the rest again. Old age and childhood, for the rest, a man lives close companion to disease and tears. Losing his love, working for other man, where can joy find a space in this short span?" So the poet says that 100 years life granted to a man is considered to be a long life. But the poet negates that even in this long life, a man cannot find ultimate joy, because half is sleep and half the rest again. Half of the life is spent in sleeping, and remaining life, even half of it is again rest. So the active life that is given to a human being, in which a person can work, in which a person can find pleasure, is very short, because even in the remaining half of the life, it comes to rest because of old age and childhood. So these two stages, childhood and old age, they are inactive stages. For the rest, a man lives close companion to disease and tears. Even rest of the life that is given to a human being is not a very happy life, because disease and tears and sadness, they overpower a human being's life. Losing his love, working for other man, and a person, he simply accepts his situations or the course of life that comes to him. So he loses the persons who are quite close to him, whom he loves, and even in the very short life, active life that is given to him, he has to work for other people. Where can joy find a space in this short span? So the poet asks that if the life that is given to us is such a short life, the active life that is given to us, the life that actually we can lead according to our own desires, is so short, where can we find joy in that short duration, in that short span? So it negates that life is full of pleasure, life is full of joys. So the last piece of verse, the sixth section, is also written by Bhartrihari, and it is a rhetorical response from a wife who is speaking when the husband is parting away or he is going away for work, and it focuses on the love that exists between a man and his wife, and the distress of the wife comes up through these lines, because she does not know how to respond to the husband who is going on for some business or work. "Do not go," I could say, but this is inauspicious. "All right, go" is the loveless thing to say. "Stay with me" is imperious. "Do as you wish" suggests cold indifference. And if I say I'll die when you are gone, you might or might not believe me. "Teach me, my husband, what I ought to say when you go away. So the wife asks her husband that if I say that do not go, this would be considered as inauspicious. And if I become indifferent and I say, okay, go, all right, go, it would be considered as a loveless thing, as an indifferent thing. Stay with me would be considered as imperious. And if I say that do whatever you want to do, it is cold indifference. And if I express my feeling that I would die if you go away, it would not be believed. So the wife, she asked her husband that just teach me, what should I say when you part away from me, when you go away from me. John Bro, 1917 to 84, was a noted Sanskrit scholar. He has also written on the Sanskrit theories of language and semantics. These translations, taken from classical anthologies, are mostly rendered in verse. John Bro, he was really fascinated by the richness of Sanskrit verses. And he wrote that Sanskrit verses, they are shapely. They have a very definite and strict metrical form and often have extremely complex and subtle sound patterns of assonance and alliteration. The qualities of rhythm, of shapeliness, of the music of the words cannot be directly transferred to another language. And there's no perfect solution. He said that another feature of Sanskrit poetry is the great wealth of synonyms or near synonyms which the poet has at his disposal. And English has an exceptionally rich vocabulary, he said that we believe, and those who use English find vocabulary more or less adequate for prosaic purposes, but for the purposes of poetry, John Bro said that in comparison to English, if we compare Sanskrit, then Sanskrit is a very rich language. English in comparison with Sanskrit is poor in the extreme. Where, for example, Sanskrit, he gave an example that for lotus, it may have some 50 expressions. So he was quite astounded by the richness of Sanskrit poetry and the language itself. So these short texts, they employ a wide variety of stanza forms. The first three sections, they are a comment upon poetry. They all deal with poetry. The fourth section or the fourth piece compresses the life of man and all it contains. And the last section, it actually deals with the reaction of or the rhetoric response of the wife. It is not the lover who speaks, but it is the beloved, the wife who speaks her thoughts and her emotions and her expressions in the final section.